Welcome to Episode 2, Hardest School of Life. Across 5 chapters, you'll hear real stories, build your vocabulary, and test your listening. Let's get started. Chapter 1, The Descent into Meidling. Listen carefully and ensure you are prepared to analyze the historical data presented in this assessment. You must pay close attention to the details of this environment to understand the social shift occurring in the narrative. This report is not merely a history lesson. It is a rigorous evaluation of your ability to process complex historical contexts and environmental descriptions. State clearly that you understand the necessity of answering the subsequent questions correctly to demonstrate your improved listening and reading comprehension skills. If you fail to note the specific physical conditions and social interactions described in this industrial landscape, you will not pass the professional evaluation. In the late months of 1909, the physical and social landscape surrounding Adolf Hitler changed drastically as he abandoned his previous residence at Stumpergasse for a much harsher existence. He moved to the Mariahilf district, an area that had become dangerously overbuilt with massive multi-story tenement buildings. Seeking the most basic forms of shelter, he eventually descended into the Meidling homeless shelter located in a heavily industrialized district. This area was characterized by its towering tenements where the residents frequently struggled for access to basic human needs like light and air. The experience of the homeless in this district was defined by a sense of waiting and strict regimentation. Upon arrival at the facility, every individual was required to undergo a specific disinfection process known as burning out to sanitize their clothing. This procedure was a mandatory requirement for those seeking a place to stay, ensuring that the rags of the destitute were cleaned before they entered the living quarters. Each person who passed through this process received a ticket that allowed for 5 nights of lodging. Within the walls of the shelter, the physical conditions were remarkably stark and utilitarian, providing a grim school of life for its inhabitants. The residents were forced to sit along long benches in a crowded dining hall to consume meager portions of soup and bread. When the time came for rest, the men were provided with cots constructed of harsh wire springs. These metallic cots were covered only with brownish-colored sheets that reflected the generally poor and unsanitary state of the facility. It was during this period of extreme poverty and social isolation that Hitler encountered Reinhold Hannisch, a traveling artist from the Sudetenland. Hannisch observed the future dictator closely and later described his physical state as remarkably frail and awkward. According to these first-hand accounts, Hitler appeared helpless in the face of these difficult surroundings and lacked the robustness one might expect from a young man. The daily life of the inhabitants revolved around the constant struggle to survive in crowded courtyards and narrow, ill-lit tenements. This industrial backdrop provided a sharp contrast to the grand architecture of the Ring Boulevard that Hitler had previously admired. The smell of disinfectant and the cold, metallic springs of the beds formed the sensory foundation of this period. Hitler's financial situation had deteriorated to the point that he finally followed Hannisch's suggestion to write to his sister, Paula, for help. She responded by sending him 50 crowns shortly before the Christmas season. This small sum of money allowed him to eventually leave the desperate conditions of the Meidling shelter. However, the memories of the brownish sheets and the long lines of the burning out process remain part of his narrative of suffering. Now let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Impoverished. From a historical perspective, this describes a state of extreme destitution where an individual lacks the basic necessities for survival, such as adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Tenement. A historical term for a large, often substandard apartment building in an industrial city characterized by overcrowding and a lack of proper ventilation or light. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 1 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. What was the primary purpose of the burning out process in the Meidling shelter? The text states that the burning out was a mandatory disinfection process used to sanitize the clothing of the homeless before they were granted lodging. How did Reinhold Hannisch characterize Hitler's physical condition in 1909? Hannisch's account specifically describes Hitler as appearing frail, awkward, and helpless during their time in the shelter. What specific detail described the sleeping conditions in the shelter? The narrative details that the inhabitants slept on cots made of wire springs and covered with brownish-colored sheets. Which district served as the industrial setting for Hitler's first experience with homelessness? The text identifies the Meidling homeless shelter as being located in a heavily industrialized district. Who provided the financial assistance that allowed Hitler to leave the shelter? The text notes that Hitler's sister sent him 50 crowns after he wrote to her for financial help. Chapter 2. Life at the Meldenmannstraße Hostel. You must now shift your focus to a new environment with significantly different social dynamics. Pay close attention to the transition from the temporary shelter to the permanent hostel and the specific nature of Hitler's early business attempts. As your senior instructor, I remind you that accuracy in the upcoming quiz is the only professional measure of your progress. You are expected to identify the differences between the various people Hitler interacted with during this period, particularly his business partners and his financiers. Listen carefully and do not allow your attention to wander from these structural details. Following their difficult time in the Meidling shelter, Hitler and Hannisch moved to a modern residence at 27 Meldenmannstraße in the district of Brigittenau. This district was a heavily industrialized area that experienced intense population growth during the early 20th century. The men's hostel was noted for its remarkably hygienic and organized nature, which provided a stable environment for its residents. The population of this facility consisted mostly of young male laborers who had come to Vienna to find work in the expanding industrial sector. In this new setting, Hitler and Hannisch formed a formal business partnership centered on the production of architectural art. Hitler took on the role of the painter, while Hannisch acted as the salesman who peddled the finished products to the public. Their primary business involved copying original postcards of famous Viennese sites, such as the Parliament and the Opera. These watercolors were sold primarily to tourists, art dealers, and frame makers. However, this partnership was frequently strained by internal conflicts regarding their professional roles and work habits. Hannisch grew deeply frustrated with what he described as Hitler's shoddy work ethic and his tendency to avoid actual labor. Instead of completing his assigned paintings, Hitler often preferred to spend his time leading intense political debates in the hostel's common rooms. He acted as a ringleader in these discussions, focusing on themes of German nationalism and the current events of the parliament. Despite these tensions, Hitler also interacted with several Jewish residents within the hostel, such as Josef Neumann. Neumann was a salesman of clothes and goods who assisted Hitler by helping him sell several of his watercolor paintings to art dealers. This relationship was significant enough that Neumann even gifted Hitler a long coat to wear during the cold winter months. The financiers of the Meldenmannstraße hostel also included prominent Jewish figures, such as Baron Nathaniel Rothschild and the Gutmann family. Hannisch's later accounts of this period contain highly contradictory claims about Hitler's personal views toward the Jewish population. While Hannisch sometimes suggested that Hitler was not a Jew hater at this time, he also recorded specific instances of Hitler making racially charged remarks. According to Hannisch, Hitler claimed that Jews were a different race and possessed a different smell. These comments suggest that Hitler had already begun to adopt the racial theories circulating in the Viennese press. Hitler eventually ended his partnership with Hannisch after a dispute over the sale of a painting depicting the parliament. Hitler accused Hannisch of stealing the work and had him arrested for misappropriating the property. After Hannisch was sentenced to a short term in jail, Hitler continued to sell his work through other agents like Jacob Altenburg. Now let's review the keywords from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Parasite. In the historical context of Viennese racial theory, this term was used as a malicious metaphor to describe a person or group accused of living off the resources of the host nation without contributing. Opportunistic. This describes a political strategy where a leader uses popular prejudices or current events to gain power or influence, regardless of their personal moral convictions. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 2 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. What was the demographic of the residents at the Meldenmannstraße hostel? The narrative states that the population of the hostel consisted largely of young male laborers. What was the specific nature of Hitler's work during his partnership with Hannes? The text explains that Hitler painted postcards of famous sites which Hannes then sold to dealers. Why did Reinhold Hannes eventually become driven to despair by Hitler? Hannes was frustrated by Hitler's shoddy work ethic and his preference for leading political debates in the hostel. Who was Josef Neumann in the context of Hitler's time in the hostel? Neumann is described as a Jewish resident and salesman who assisted Hitler with his business and provided him with clothing. Which prominent family was among the financiers of the Meldenmannstraße hostel? The text notes that the principal financiers of the hostel included Baron Nathaniel Rothschild. Quick break. If you're enjoying this episode, hit like and subscribe to help us make more videos like this. Now, on to Chapter 3. Chapter 3, The Political Shadows of Vienna. Listen carefully to the differences between the two political figures I am about to analyze. As a student of history, you must understand that the models of leadership Hitler observed in the streets and parliament of Vienna are vital for your upcoming assessment. You are required to distinguish between ideological conviction and tactical political strategy. If you cannot explain the nuance between these two men, Schonerer and Luger, you will fail to understand the granite foundation of the events that followed in German history. Pay attention now to the structural differences in their anti-Semitic platforms. During his formative years in Vienna, Hitler's worldview was heavily influenced by two primary political figures who represented different styles of leadership, Georg Ritter von Schonerer and Dr. Karl Lueger. Schonerer was the leader of the German Nationalist Party and was the most famous promoter of pan-German nationalism in the city. He advocated for a united German state and promoted a platform known as the Linz Program. This program was notable for its extreme stance, calling for the total elimination of Jewish influence in all areas of public life. Schonerer's anti-Semitism was rooted in ideas of race and ethnicity, viewing Jews as an alien element that could not be assimilated. He even amended his program in 1885 to insist that the removal of this influence was indispensable for national reform. In contrast, Dr. Karl Lueger served as the highly popular mayor of Vienna and led the Christian Social Party. Lueger's approach to politics was characterized by his opportunistic use of religious anti-Semitism. Unlike Schonerer, Lueger utilized existing prejudices as a weapon of mass mobilization to win over the working-class Christian voters of the city. He often used crude and heartless rhetoric in his speeches to blame Jews for the economic misfortunes of the petty bourgeoisie. Hitler spent a significant amount of time observing both men and their different methods of gaining and maintaining power. He deeply admired Lueger's knowledge of men and his ability to navigate established political institutions to his advantage. Lueger was appointed mayor in 1897 and remained a celebrated figure until his death in 1910. However, Hitler also expressed criticism regarding the depth of Lueger's ideological convictions. He found Lueger's brand of anti-Semitism to be half-hearted because it focused on religion rather than race. This meant that Lueger was willing to accept Jews who converted to Christianity through baptism. A famous caricature from the time depicted a Jewish man offering a baptism certificate to Lueger to gain his favor. Despite this criticism, Hitler recognized that Lueger was more successful than Schoenerer at winning the support of the broad masses. Schoenerer was viewed as the more profound thinker regarding national principles, but he lacked the tactical flexibility that Lueger possessed. Schoenerer's followers were often small in number compared to the thousands who attended Lueger's citywide funeral. Hitler noted that Schoenerer failed because he did not understand how to appeal to the emotions of the working class. This combination of Schoenerer's ethnic radicalism and Lueger's political strategies formed the basis of Hitler's political education. He later synthesized these two models into his own movement, combining extreme racial ideology with mass marketing techniques. Now let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Radicalized. The social and psychological process through which an individual adopts extreme political or social views that completely reject the existing democratic or social order. Radical. A person who advocates for a complete and fundamental change in the laws and structures of a society, often through extreme or non-traditional means. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 3 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. What was the primary goal of Georg Ritter von Schoenerer's Linz program? The text states that the Linz program called for the annexation of Austria into Germany and the elimination of Jewish influence. How did Dr. Karl Lueger's brand of anti-Semitism differ from Schoenerer's? Lueger is described as using religious anti-Semitism as an opportunistic tool to mobilize voters. Why did Hitler criticize Lueger's anti-Semitism as half-hearted? Hitler criticized Lueger because his religious focus allowed Jews to bypass prejudice through baptism. Which political figure did Hitler admire for his knowledge of men and ability to win the masses? The text explicitly mentions that Hitler admired Lueger's knowledge of men and his success with the masses. What was Schoenerer's major flaw in Hitler's assessment? Hitler believed Schoenerer failed because he lacked the support of the masses and tactical flexibility. Chapter 4, The Poison of the Press. Examine the inflammatory language used in the historical publications circulating in early 20th century Vienna. You must differentiate between the different types of media, ranging from the liberal world press to the gutter literature of the far right, to pass the comprehension check. The media environment of this period was filled with propaganda that played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Failure to recognize the specific names, arguments, and circulation of these publications will result in an incomplete understanding of this historical period and a failing grade on the assessment. During his time in Vienna, Hitler was a vociferous reader of the local press, which played a decisive role in the development of his extreme worldview. He lived in close proximity to the editorial offices of the Alldeutsches Tagblatt, a newspaper that supported the pan-German views of Schoenerer. This newspaper was located at 17 Stumpergasse, the same street where Hitler resided during his early years in the city. The Alldeutsches Tagblatt advertised itself as an incorruptible newspaper, dedicated to the interests of the German people. Another highly influential publication was the Deutsches Volksblatt, which had a daily circulation of approximately 20,000 copies. This newspaper frequently used extreme and violent rhetoric, labeling the Jewish population as parasites, scroungers, and exploiters. Beyond these mainstream political newspapers, Hitler also consumed gutter literature, such as the Ostara pamphlets. These pamphlets were published by J. Lanz von Liebenfels and promoted a pseudoscientific theory known as theozoology. The core obsession of Astara was racial purity, creating a biological hierarchy between the blonde, heroic people and the dark people. Liebenfels' writing utilized aggressively vulgar language to warn against the mixing of these different racial groups. One 1906 illustration in Astara even depicted a caricatured ape man to represent what Liebenfels called inferior races. As Hitler consumed these materials, he developed a growing resentment toward what he called the Jewish-controlled liberal press. He specifically targeted the Neue Freie Presse, which was a leading liberal newspaper with a large circulation of 65,000 copies. Hitler accused these liberal publications of operating a net of deceit and poisoning the German spirit. He believed that the editors of these papers were using their influence to destroy traditional German thought. An anti-Semitic postcard from 1910 even depicted caricatured figures injecting Semitic spirit into a reader's head. This visual propaganda echoed Hitler's own claims that the liberal press was a germ carrier of the worst sort. By his own admission, the time he spent reading these anti-Semitic publications was the most thorough school for his education in prejudice. This media environment provided the specific terminology and proof that Hitler used to justify his evolving racial beliefs. He eventually claimed that the Jewish press was responsible for 9/10 of all literary trash in the city. This exposure to inflammatory media occurred during a period of intense urbanization, where newspapers were the primary source of information for the masses. Now, let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Inflammatory, a type of high-intensity communication designed to arouse anger, hostility, or violent feelings in an audience toward a specific group. Hygiene. In the context of early 20th century racial theory, this referred to racial hygiene, the pseudoscientific belief that a nation must remain pure by preventing the biological mixing of different ethnic groups. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 4 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. Which publication was responsible for promoting the theory of theozoology? The text states that Lanz von Liebenfels published Astara to promote the theory of theozoology. What was the primary focus of the Astara pamphlets? Astara focused on racial purity and the hierarchy between perceived superior and inferior racial groups. How did the Deutsches Volksblatt characterize the Jewish population? The narrative notes that the Deutsches Volksblatt used rhetoric labeling Jews as parasites and scroungers. What was Hitler's main criticism of the world press, like the Neue Freie Presse? Hitler targeted the Neue Freie Presse as a Jewish-controlled paper that spread deceit. Where were the offices of the Alldeutsches Tagblatt located relative to Hitler? The text mentions that the offices were located at 17 Stumpergasse, where Hitler also lived. Chapter 5, The Encounter in the Inner City. This is the most critical part of the narrative and the final section of your evaluation. Listen carefully to the descriptions of the streets and the conflicting accounts of the historical witnesses. Your final score depends entirely on your understanding of this perceived turning point in Hitler's psychological development. You must be able to distinguish between what Hitler claimed happened in his propaganda and what other residents of Vienna observed during the same years. Pay close attention to the details of dress, behavior, and the geography of the inner city. In his later writings, Hitler described a semi-mythical encounter in the inner city of Vienna that he claimed was the final turning point in his education. He recounted suddenly seeing an apparition in a black caftan and black hair locks while strolling through the city center. This encounter prompted him to ask the psychological questions: is this a Jew? And subsequently, Is this a German? This description focused on the perceived otherness of the Ostjuden, or Eastern European Jews, who had recently immigrated to the city from regions like Galicia. This encounter was closely linked to observations made by Hanisch, who recalled Hitler making remarks about different races and the specific smell of certain groups. However, this perspective of racial hatred was not the only reaction to the presence of immigrants in Vienna. Dr. Hans Kimmel, a Jewish law student who lived on the Kleine Pfarrgasse in Leopoldstadt during the same years, witnessed the same environment but had a vastly different reaction. Kimmel observed violent anti-Semitic demonstrations on the Taborstrasse where crowds shouted "Eastern Jews out." While Hitler saw these immigrants as an alien element and a threat to the nation, Kimmel saw the demonstrations as senseless and unjustified. Kimmel questioned why there was so much antipathy toward a group of people who were often no better off than the rest of the struggling population. Another specific incident from this period was recorded by August Kubizek regarding Handelies. These were traditional Eastern European Jews who peddled goods like shoelaces and buttons in the streets. Kubizek recalled Hitler taking legal action against one such man who was begging for money. Hitler volunteered as a witness for the police, claiming he had seen the peddler with 3,000 crowns as proof of the exploitation of the city. While Hitler claimed these street encounters proved his racial theories, Kimmel's memoir serves as a reminder that the choice to adopt such hatred was not inevitable. Kimmel noted that the police often treated the violent anti-Semitic crowds gently, which he attributed to the influence of Mayor Luger. This environment of public hostility served as a visual instruction for Hitler's growing convictions. By the time he left Vienna for Munich in 1913, Hitler claimed to have completed his schooling and become a convinced anti-Semite. However, the presence of voices like Kimmel's suggests that Hitler actively chose to follow the teachers of hate. The streets of Vienna provided the backdrop for a tragedy that would eventually affect all of Europe. Now let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Apparition. In a historical narrative, this refers to an image or person that appears suddenly and strangely. Hitler used this term to emphasize the perceived unearthly or alien nature of the people he encountered. Resentment. A deep-seated feeling of indignation or ill will that arises from the belief that one has been treated unfairly or that others are gaining an unearned advantage. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 5 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. What specific appearance did Hitler describe for the apparition he encountered? Hitler's account in Mein Kampf specifically mentions seeing a man in a black kaftan and black hair locks. How did Dr. Hans Kimmel view the Eastern Jews out protests in Leopoldstadt? Kimmel's memoir characterizes the anti-Semitic demonstrations he witnessed as senseless and unjustified. What was the Handelies incident described by August Kubizek? The text notes that Hitler volunteered to testify against a Handeli, claiming he had 3,000 crowns as proof of exploitation. In which district did Dr. Hans Kimmel witness violent anti-Semitic demonstrations? The narrative places Kimmel in Leopoldstadt, where he saw protests on the Taborstrasse. According to Hanisch, what did Hitler say about the smell of certain groups? Hanisch recalled Hitler stating that certain groups had a different smell because they were a different race. That's a wrap on Episode 2, Hardest School of Life. If this helped your English, hit like and subscribe to help us make more videos like this. See you in the next one.